Welcome back to Module 3, Reforming Ohio. Today our subject is the decline of the Ohio Way. The time period covers the 1910s and 1920s, when Ohioans began to tear apart the culture that had contributed to the state's economic and political vibrancy. We'll focus on two of the three elements of the Ohio Way: global networks and culture, the two aspects that Ohioans had the most control over. And the curious thing is that Ohioans chose to tear down what they had built up. In part, this happened because the Ohio Way always had contradictory impulses. First, a democratic spirit in which individuals could make a successful life for themselves, versus an authoritarian streak that not only dictated how people should define success, but narrowly limited the kind of people who could be successful. And second, embedded within the invitation to reform was a humane sense of accountability to one another that all too easily turned into an obsession with respectable behavior, an anxious life lived in public under watchful eyes. We'll start with the ways Ohioans undermined their global networks. World War I, fought from 1914 to 1918, stopped global immigration. After World War I, immigration itself turned into a perceived negative. Strangers seemed to bring more danger than value. Why? In part, this shift was about conflict between working-class Americans and wealthy factory owners. In 1919, across the nation, but especially in Ohio, waves of strikes hit industrial towns. In Ohio alone, there were 237 strikes. And while the strikes involved several industries, the steel industry was the hardest hit. 100,000 Ohio steelworkers went on strike. Now, all of these strikes were local in scope, a fight between specific workers and owners in a factory town over wage cuts and increased hours. But the owners of factories explained that these strikes were part of a conspiracy planned by foreigners. The owners reminded native-born Ohioans that most of their factory workers were foreign-born, and thus a bit suspicious. After all, the Ohio Way had openly questioned whether immigrants had the discipline, the character, to be good Americans. How could they be if they were always in saloons? And the context of the Russian Revolution aided the owners in their attempts to smear the workers. In 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, overthrew the Russian government and instituted a communist regime. So the owners successfully frightened middle-class people, persuading them that immigrants who lived across town were taking their cues from Lenin, that they were intent on abolishing private property and overthrowing the American government. And it worked. Consider this editorial cartoon published in the Columbus Dispatch in March 1919. Note that Uncle Sam is standing over his melting pot and considering what he has cooked up. Was it a democratic capitalist wonder in which people from all over the world came to the United States and were reborn as Americans, something new and better than their old selves in Europe? Or was it a mess because immigrants had not, in fact, been reborn? They had instead brought their baggage, their bad ideas like Bolshevism, anarchy, and un-American ideals. Uncle Sam had tossed all of these diverse Europeans into the pot, hoping to forge a new American, but all he got instead was the mad notions of Europe. And as the Columbus Dispatch said, we cannot digest the scum. Let's be clear about what's going on. Ever since Cincinnati exploded to preeminent status on the frontier, tensions over immigration had been a defining part of life in Ohio. But by 1920, the forces of xenophobia had gained national power in a federal government that was far more capable than it had been in 1850. It now had the bureaucratic expertise, the finances, the law enforcement resources to severely restrict immigration. And so in 1921, President Warren G. Harding, a Republican from Ohio, signed into law a quota system that made it more difficult for immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe to enter the country. It would be the first in a series of anti-immigrant steps in the 1920s that greatly favored Northern Europeans and immigrants from the Western Hemisphere over Italians, Russians, and Eastern and Central Europeans. Harding and his Republicans passed these laws in part because immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were more likely to vote Democratic. Now, these laws had an immediate effect on Ohio. By 1930, Ohio's foreign-born population dropped to 10%, the lowest percentage of immigrants in the state's 127-year history. And in 1910, that number had plummeted to 4.1%. But factory owners still needed workers. Where would they come from? After World War I, owners set out an ambitious plan to recruit from the South, especially from Appalachia. So ambitious that they actually changed the makeup of the state's working class. By 1973, 1 out of every 3 industrial workers in Ohio was from Appalachia. African American working class migrants came from the South, too. From 1910 to 1920, for example, Cleveland's black population grew by 308%. In 1910, 40% of Ohio's black population had been born in the South. By contrast, in 1920, 57% had been born in the South. In the context of the rapid rise of African American migrants to Ohio, and in the context of increased xenophobia after World War I, the Ku Klux Klan rose to prominence in Ohio. Now, the Klan of the late 19th century was different from the Klan of the 1920s in 2 major ways. First, the Klan of the 1920s extended its prejudice to include more groups than just African Americans. The new Klan disliked foreigners, non-white racial groups, and non-Protestants. And second, during the 19th century, the Klan was strongest in the South. But during the early 20th century, the Klan extended its power base to the North as well. And in fact, the KKK was especially strong in Ohio during the 1910s and the 1920s. For example, by 1923 and 1924, there were an estimated 400,000 Ohioans in the Klan. In Summit County, the Klan claimed to have 50,000 members, making it the largest local chapter in the United States. And many of the county's officials were members, too, including the sheriff, the Akron mayor, several judges and county commissioners, and most members of the Akron School Board. Now, the Klan claimed to recruit people, quote, whose reputations and vocations are respectable, whose habits were exemplary, so that they could fight for the ideals of pure Americanism. This quote came from Klan handbooks, but they weren't too far from the sentiments of William Mahomes McGuffey. My point here is not that McGuffey founded the Klan. No. My point is that the Ohio Way had embedded within it the potential for the use of power that erupted in the rise of the KKK. They skipped right past the invitation to reform and chose instead to use violence and bigoted laws to compel Ohio to look the way they thought it should look. Clearly, Ohioans had chosen to undermine the value of the international networks by erecting barriers to immigration and by embracing xenophobic groups like the KKK. But they also chose to tear down their culture in less pernicious and violent ways, but still tear it down they did. We can see a full attack on the Ohio Way in the writings of novelist Sherwood Anderson. Anderson was born in 1876 in Preble County, Ohio, and raised in Clyde in Sandusky County. As an adult, Anderson became a successful business executive in Cleveland. In 1912, however, he suffered emotional breakdown, and then after recovering, divorced his wife and moved to Chicago to earn a living as a writer. In Chicago, he wrote the novel Winesburg, Ohio, in 1919, which became a bestseller and sealed his fame within literary circles. Winesburg, Ohio is about a fictional Ohio town, modeled after his home of Clyde, and it tells a variety of stories about the characters in town. The town itself is a prosperous 19th century place of 2,000 residents, with tree-lined streets, attractive, well-built homes, and a thriving downtown. The people of Winesburg appear to be happy. They lead respectable lives and enjoy material comfort. But beneath the surface, they suffer from sadness. They lead lonely, unfulfilling lives. In Winesburg, Ohio, Anderson explored what happens when people neglect themselves to meet the expectations of others. In other words, he explored the consequences of the Ohio Way. Consider in particular 2 characters, Curtis Hartman, a Presbyterian minister, and Kate Swift, a teacher. Both characters were products of Ohio's success. They had believed in self-improvement and discipline, and they had been rewarded with decent, respectable jobs. But they were profoundly unhappy. Hartman, for example, is unhappy in his marriage and work. He takes nightly walks to escape the pressures of the respectable life everyone tells him he should love. And one night on one of his long walks, he accidentally saw Swift, the teacher, through a window, smoking and lying on her bed. Hartman is, of course, ashamed, but night after night he returns to watch, even breaking a stained glass window to see her. And Swift was just as lonely. A teacher, she had feelings for one of her students, feelings that she was deeply ashamed of and tried to control but could not. And so the guardians of Weinsberg's respectability were both frustrated, lonely people, ashamed of the true feelings. Middle class respectability had not liberated them, it had shackled them. Anderson's life and work suggested a new emerging Ohio and a new emerging America as well. Meaning should be found not in self denial, but self fulfillment, and you should reform yourself, not others. And, Anderson argued, Ohio would be a good place once again if only its citizens would stop imposing their worldview on others. The popularity of Weinsberg, Ohio, suggested that many people agreed with him. So, what happened in this period from roughly World War I through the 1920s? Clearly, Ohioans turned on their heritage. And by heritage, I mean the ideas and behaviors that built Ohio. Recall that Ohio was invented specifically to facilitate interracial and international trade. And recall that Ohio, the state, came of age in a period of intense technological change, a period that allowed peoples, ideas, goods, and diseases to travel farther and faster than ever before. Ohio was made by and open to the world. But by World War I, native-born Ohioans, especially those in the middle and upper classes, those with economic and political power especially, encouraged a wave of xenophobia, using fear of foreigners to maintain elite control of economic power and privilege. By the 1920s, Ohioans also began attacking the core idea of the Ohio Way. What, they asked, is a good citizen? Throughout the 19th century, Ohioans reliably answered that question with stock phrases. A good citizen works hard, is disciplined and obeys rules, is sober and thrifty, and improves his skills in order to improve his socioeconomic status. These habits date to the 1830s and were closely associated with William Holmes McGuffey and his elementary school textbooks. Whatever the words used to describe a good citizen, the idea came down to one sentence. A good citizen worked. They had a job, they showed up on time, they followed the boss's rules, and diligently tried to get ahead. But what if you were unemployed? What if you were laid off? Well, that just means that you did something wrong. So you should fix yourself. Your bad habits were to blame for your misfortune. So a good, respectable citizen had a job, worked hard, stayed sober, and saved money, and then judged other people by those same habits. But by the 1920s, Ohioans were beginning to imagine a world in which citizenship and respectability and political power were not tied to economic purpose. They were beginning to imagine a world that didn't blame individuals when entire communities collapsed because a factory shut down, and when families struggled with the fallout. Some Ohioans began to imagine a world, that is, that looked a lot like J.D. Vance's world as he describes it in Hillbilly Elegy. A world in which people struggled to cope with economic decline and social disintegration. But that's the subject for the next several lectures.